All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. This is your host, Christian Bacasa. This week, we have a special guest, Karin Miller from Zen Tenkara. Yes, Tenkara, the often misunderstood art of fly fishing by many, I would say. And Karin, you are the owner-operator of Zen Tenkara, but you were originally out of Florida, moved to Colorado years ago, started fly fishing and had some frustration with the not having any fishing experience, but one day was handed a Tenkara rod and started to get really efficient with that very quickly. And it led to some of the passion that you have now to be quite specific around Tenkara and also becoming a head runner and developing some of the newer style rods and approaches to different species, etc. So this week, we're really looking forward to connecting with you on that, learning a little bit about how you've made some of those transitions and the differentiators between your product and others, etc. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Very excited.
It's good to have you. So let's jump right in here. You started Zen Tenkara, I believe it was back in 2012. Prior to that, you spent quite a bit of time exclusive Tenkara fishing, and then you went back to more of the traditional styles and picked that up again, but really kind of kept that love for Tenkara. Can you talk just a little bit about that? And then let's talk about, maybe some of the rod design and development aspects.
Yeah, sure. I describe myself as a reluctant fly angler when I first learned how to fly fish. I hate to say it, but I didn't fall in love with it right away. When I finally was handed a Tenkara rod, it just, I wondered why hadn't anybody ever showed me how to do this before, and why was I carrying around 90 feet of line when I was only casting 20 feet away,
Right.
in the rivers in Colorado. I kind of went down the rabbit hole head first and got totally consumed by Tenkara, became very proficient at it. And eventually, after a few years of landing a bunch of fish and feeling confident in what I was doing as a Tenkara angler, I decided to pick up my rod and reel again that I hadn't touched in a few years. And I gotta say, when I stepped away from the rod and reel, I was excited by a 30-foot cast. That was like, woohoo, I did it. The first time I picked up my rod and reel again, I decided to lay down some markers in the middle of the road. I lived in a cul-de-sac, and I measured out, 30 feet, 40 feet, I was like, I'm not really going to go probably beyond 40 feet, but I'll make myself look good. And I picked up my rod, and on the very first cast, I laid out a bunch of line, and I passed the 40-foot marker by a good amount. And so I measured it out. My first cast was 62 feet when I picked up my rod and reel again. And the funny part of that is I was thrilled. I was ecstatic. And I was like, oh my gosh, I got to take a picture of this, because nobody will believe me. And I laid my rod and reel down, and I ran into the house to go get my phone to take a picture. And as I'm coming out the front door, my neighbor is backing out of their driveway and proceeds to run right over my rod and reel. And I'm, yelling, stop, stop. And they're waving, saying hi. And I'm like,
it's great to see you too.
But so I really feel like it it just made my learning trajectory just skyrocket.
Yeah.
Tenkara did.
Yeah.
And all of it applies to a regular rod and reel. And, I'm obviously a Tenkara junkie, but, I use a rod and reel. I have a 4 weight, a 5 weight, a 7 weight, an 8 weight, a 9 weight, a 10 weight, 11 weight, and two 12 weights. So
Right. Right.
I've got a little bit of a problem across the board.
Right. That's good. That's
So
good. And we're going to get into that later too, because you have a tip that we're going to share at the end of the show around the fishing triangle for fish management, which is
yes,
applicable to both sides. And I'm excited to talk about that as well. So,
yeah,
yeah. So when you say the trajectory changed and you lean towards Tenkara being a facilitator to that, what was it in the Tenkara simplicity that helped you in the conventional side?
yeah. You know, as somebody coming into fly fishing without any background, I mentioned I hadn't even done any spin fishing. Um, you'd go out with people who were teaching you, and they'd be like, let the rod load. You've got to, don't bring it forward until the rod loads. And then, how many times did I stand in the river and, you know, got told that was a hit. That was a hit. That was a hit. And I didn't feel the hook set. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know what that felt like. All of those, all of those things were such discrete signals for me. I didn't know what I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finally did recognize it, my reaction to it then was also slow. So, when you learn to fly fish, there's layers, and the very, one of the first layers is reaching the fish, right? You got to know where fish are. You got to be able to reach them. You do that through casting. You have to be able to present to make the fish actually move and strike what you're serving them, right? You got to be
Right,
able to
right.
fake them out. Then you've got to be able to set the hook, and that's a motoric response.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right?
Yeah. And
That's
in between, you're managing your line,
and you're
right?
managing your line, and then once you get the fish on, then you actually have to keep them on,
Mm-hmm.
um, and make sure they don't throw the hook and land them. So there are all these things, and casting is difficult in and of itself. Just figuring out how to do that, and what it means when a rod loads. Um, the hook set, if you don't even recognize when a fish is nibbling at your fly, or you can't feel it, then you're missing the opportunity to actually practice that fast muscle reflex,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
you don't even know it's happening, so you're not responding. When I started to use the Tenkara rod, all of a sudden, because these rods are ultra lightweight, I mean, we're talking anywhere from 1.5, to 3.5 ounces. Because the line is attached directly to the end of the tip, it's not running along the length of the rod. There are no guides. There is no reel. There's nothing dampening that tactile
Right.
feedback.
No hens
Um,
between the guides, etc. Yeah.
Yep, all of those things. I mean, you've got this ultralight, hollow carbon fiber extension of your arm, and you feel the slightest, tick. You can tell when the rod loads. You can feel that. And so I think because the feedback is so much more pronounced, you get it quicker, and you actually then have an opportunity to respond with a physical motion or movement or behavior,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
whether that's the cast in bringing the rod forward, or whether that's a quick hook set. You
Mm-hmm.
you feel more, so your opportunity to actually learn and experience it is increased.
Yeah. Yeah. And you are simplifying. You're taking elements out, right? I mean, you talk about line management, right? The line management in your left hand is non-existent.
Right.
You have a long lever, very sensitive tip, right? A longer lever, more vibration, etc., to indicate a strike. You can lift your leader off of the water with that long leader, have very little impact of water on your leader, etc. So, yeah, there are some really unique characteristics to Tenkara that are super fun to
Yeah.
experiment with and can really help develop your standard fly fishing as well. I think.
Absolutely. I mean, when I first fished Tenkara, I used Sakasa Kabaris, very generic, basic um, Tenkara flies, right? With the hackle forward,
Yep.
no real body, easiest fly to tie if you want to get into tying. That's a great place to
Right.
start. But it wasn't about matching the hatch. It was about doing more with your fly. So you had this nondescript fly and this ultralight, ultra sensitive rod. Well, once you got the fly in the water, then you had a lot of options for manipulating it, creating motion, creating
Mm-hmm.
movement. I could take one fly and fish it dry with a dead drift. I could take that same fly with floating on it and skitter it across the water. I
Mm-hmm.
could, take that same fly and let it float and pulse it through the water.
You could
It
swing
just,
it, right?
you could swing it. You could do, pretty much anything that you present with a typical fly pattern. You can mimic that with a Sakasa Kabari. And so it just simplified things. If I could get proficient with one fly and do all these things, then over time I could start to experiment um, with other fly patterns. But I had learned to do so much more
Mm-hmm.
with my fly that then I could bring that to these other patterns as well,
Yeah.
which I think was, really, kind of a neat concept, because a lot of people will throw a dry fly on and all they do is dead drift it.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of insects in the water, that are sitting on the surface that are alive and moving. So, you
Or
can
they
get
get
a,
buried in the entomology immediately, and it's like, is
right.
that really the answer? Usually it's not. Most of the time it's some level of simplicity of silhouette and you can pick up fish.
Yeah, kind of a size, shape, motion sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Keep it simple. And when I get on my conventional, when I use my conventional gear, I I do tend to switch my patterns more.
Mm.
I fall into that habit of, oh, well, maybe I need to try this, maybe I need to try that. And sometimes I have to consciously remind myself, what, don't switch the pattern. Maybe just work it a little
Mm-hmm.
more,
Okay.
and you
Like it.
probably will get something out of it. So,
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the development and design and what makes the rods different from each other in the Tenkara specific realm. I know that you've made quite a transition in your business over the past couple of years to some of the bigger, longer rods for different types of species, et cetera. Can you shed some light on that for us?
yeah. So oddly, the very well, the second rod that Zen came out with was actually our massive Kyojin. and we made that rod originally with the idea of targeting carp,
Okay.
because back then we thought that's what we needed to land carp without a reel, but we found out that actually that rod is probably overkill for for carp. We overbuilt it, but we made that rod really to prove a point, that we were doing something different, that we were our own company with our own ideas, and we were trying to set ourselves apart right from the get go. Tenkara rods generally they don't have a weight assignment, and so there's a lot of confusion around, Tenkara rods. They're usually described by length and by flex. And when I say flex, there's usually a ratio figure, like a 6'4" or a 5'5" or a 7'3", and that refers to the percentage of the rod that is stiff versus the percentage of the rod that is soft or flexible.
Okay.
Now, keep in mind, there's always going to be some flex in the rod, even even in those stiffer sections.
Right. So
but
let's break that down. Excuse me. Don't mean to interrupt, but
no,
let's take a typical, like, standard Tenkara rod is what, 12 feet, right?
that's very common. Yes.
Common.
Yeah.
And then give us one of those ratios and describe how that would look physically on the rod. How many feet of the tip and how many feet of the butt section?
Sure. So a 5'5" flex would be considered a slower action rod, a softer rod. 50% of that rod is going to be stiff, and 50% is going to be softer and flex. So on a 12-foot rod, that would be 6 and 6. 6 and 6. And so you should get that deep bend at about halfway down the rod. A 6.
What's the advantage of that type of bend versus one that has maybe a shorter flex in the tip or a longer flex in the tip? Why are you making that change?
That's not a straightforward answer.
Okay.
Part of it is personal preference. Some people just like a very soft rod, almost like a bamboo feel. They enjoy the play and the finesse that it requires. However, when you have a very soft rod, you have more play, and sort of can finesse the fish, but you also lose a little bit of control the softer the rod is, right? Because you've got this rod that's bending over, so you don't have a lot of power, you don't have a lot of control. Right. That being said, just because a rod is a 5'5" flex, there's still characteristics of the way the blank is rolled and the diameter and the type of carbon fiber that's used, etc., that is going to affect the performance of that rod. Whether it's going to be wobbly and just kind of all over the place, or whether it's going to bend deep, but it's going to dampen quickly and still be very accurate in the casting and things like that.
Yeah, and it's almost a loaded question, right, that I ask, because I always equate, rods. People go out, oh, this rod or that rod, and typically what most people like is the rod that they learn how to cast on, right? If it's similar to that, oh yeah, that's the one. It's like, it is a preference thing. So that was kind of some of my curiosity. Is it the same, or is there some slight difference? But it sounds like it's very much the same as a conventional rod in nature, on how you pick a rod or choose a rod. But there are elements of it that you or the style of fishing may lean towards. Is that a correct way to kind of summarize what you just said?
Yeah, if I'm fishing some, smaller rivers and I'm getting into, a lot of native trout, and maybe the 6 to 12 inch, I might enjoy a nice soft rod that's just going to be, fun and graceful and just, and enjoyable.
Right.
But if I'm maybe in back country where I need a small rod, but I have root balls and just little pools and undercuts. A soft rod might not work there because I need backbone to be able to pull that fish in quickly so that
Mm-hmm.
they don't break off in undercuts or in root balls and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, if you're casting in saltwater where you're dealing with a lot of wind or heavier flies, you might want a faster action rod
Mm-hmm.
so that you can, get a better
Project your fly.
cast and punch it through the wind. So it all
Mm-hmm.
kind of depends on what your intended use for the rod is.
Okay, great. You mentioned saltwater, and that's a subject I want to kind of talk on. Is you've really made quite a transition to other species and targets and saltwater with Tenkara, and um, you've been kind of a pioneer in a lot of ways in that space as a business, as an individual angler, etc. So talk about that. I think I'll give the example. We have a lot of guys here that they fish smallies, and it's becoming more and more popular because it's readily available, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And Tenkara is a great way to target them. I mean, you can
Oh,
often see them, sight fish to them, etc. So give us a little bit on that, and then we'll jump into some of the saltwater stuff and how you've handled that as well.
well, I, I think there are very few species that I would say are impossible on a Tenkara rod. I think the majority of species that you target on conventional gear, you can target on Tenkara, and a lot of times much more efficiently. You just scale it down, keep it simple, and kind of channel your 8-year-old self back into fishing.
Got my
um,
cane pole and I'm ready to go.
I got my cable. I know it pisses a lot of Tenkara anglers off just to say cane pole in the same sentence as Tenkara, but I have no issue with it personally. I'm
Right.
like, yeah, it is a cane pole, except for, it's carbon fiber and it's in
Right.
sections and, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah. So yeah, but if that's the picture you've got in your mind, absolutely. I say if there's a species that is available in your area and you enjoy targeting it, then go for it.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that I will say is when you decide to approach it with a Tenkara rod, you just have to be a little bit more thoughtful. I like that process because I think being thoughtful about it is how I learn. And I think it's made me a better angler to learn why things work or why things didn't work and what I need to do or change to be successful.
Okay.
So, if you're casting to a pond, what's the distance you need to cast? What kind of flies are you going to be launching out there? How is that going to feel on a Tenkara rod? Do you need a stiffer tip? Do you need a floating line? Do you need, do you need to reach 30 feet or 40 feet? How does this fish respond? Are they going to jump? Are they going to run? Are they just going to tug and hunker down?
Mm-hmm.
What's behind me? Can I do a full back cast? If I can't and I need to cast a long line, do I need to do some, snap tees to pick up all that line and get it
Mm-hmm.
out there? So it's kind of like, you kind of think of the species and you think about where you're fishing and you say, okay, how are we going to do this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you figure it out.
Yeah. So you brought up an item that for me, I'm not terribly educated on, and that is, are you changing your leader for your length very often, or is that a less common thing? How are you changing your reach? Is it more rod length, or is it a combination of the two, etc.? Um,
Well, I think it depends on where and what I'm fishing for. So whenever I go someplace new that I'm unfamiliar with, right? Because when it comes to fishing our home water, we know what we need.
right.
It's like, yeah, I know this, I know that, we need it, blah. That's why we call it home water. When I go someplace new, I ask questions and I try to get pictures, so I'll Google the river. I want to know how wide it is. If I'm going with a guide, I'll ask them, on average, what is the distance I'm going to be required
Mm-hmm.
to cast? If I'm not going with a guide, I'll talk to a fly shop. And I'll always make sure to go in there after they give me good information and make some purchases because that information is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, are these fish going to be skittish? What do I need to reach them? What kind of flies am I going to be casting? And that's how you figure it out. If I'm up on the North Platte and I'm waiting, I might be using, a 13 and a half foot rod with a 15-foot line and maybe 6 feet of tippet, straight tippet. If I am doing a float trip up out of Wyoming, I will probably I'll use my 15-foot rod with a 15-foot line and 8-foot leader tippet setup. So I can get way out there and hold everything up and just get that pristine drift,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
If I am in the saltwater, I might be on my 12 or 15-foot rod and I will have on a 28-foot line and I will probably attach to that like a Rio. Did I lose you?
I'm still here.
Okay, I can't see you, but we'll keep talking.
Yeah.
On that saltwater setup, I will probably use a 10-foot tapered leader,
Okay.
probably a bonefish leader, or something that I will build myself. And it'll be usually 12 to 16 pound test, depending
Mm-hmm. Yep.
on where I am. So, it changes. There isn't a set recipe. It's more based on, the species you're fishing.
Mm-hmm.
I can I
But
try?
during the day, are you typically changing that or adjusting that, or it's pretty much like, okay, this is the environment that I'm going to be in, and it's pretty static for the most part?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Once you come to, the river and you kind of see what you need, then it's like, no, this'll work. There might be a couple shots that I can't get to, but it's pretty rare. Like, when I go, for instance, to Alaska, I'll set my rod up and I probably, for most of those rivers, I probably won't change the line or the leader setup.
Okay.
There might be 1 or 2 days if I come to a different size river.
Right. You go on a fly out, and you're like, oh, this is actually a smaller creek. I'm going to take a different rod or a different leader setup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
usually the same rod. It's just we're going to shorten that leader, or
Right.
I don't a 15-foot line with with the leader pretty much handles 99% of everything,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because remember, if you have a 15-foot line, you can always put on, a longer leader
Piece of
tipper
tippet.
setup.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, so you could extend that by, 7 or 10 feet pretty easy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk about saltwater because this is just I'm fascinated by it. The power of the fish is totally different. Um, Water's typically very clear, right?
yes.
You're sight fishing.
Yes.
It sounds like to me, Tenkara is a lot like you got to be a little more stealthy. You got to, really kind of be gentle in your approach. And it's like this almost like archery versus rifle scenario where I can make a, 60, 70 foot cast versus, okay, I got some feeding bonefish and I'm going to try and get in close and, use a shorter leader and, you know, go about it that way. Can you shed some light on that?
Yes. So I'm a bit of a saltwater junkie. And I'm also a bit of an adrenaline junkie. So Tenkara in the salt is just like you're leveling up. Like, it's not just big fish on Tenkara. It's crazy on Tenkara because, in a river, if you hook into a big brown or, a 22 inch Alaskan rainbow, right? They're going to go upstream or they're going to go downstream.
Right.
They basically have two directions to run in. In the ocean, it's all out craziness because it's usually 360 degrees, that they can move in, and depending on um, how you're fishing, whether you're wading or whether you are on a flats boat, that changes things really
Yeah.
differently
Yeah.
as well. Um, so I have done tarpon and bonefish, small permit, barracuda, jack crevellies, bluefin,
Hmm.
got my first trigger fish ever
Yeah.
in Cuba this past October, which was really exciting because I could never land one on my rod and reel. So freaking frustrated by those fish, tricky triggers. And I finally was chasing bones when I spotted a trigger and hooked into them, and that was really just a thrill.
Yeah.
Did not have any kind of a wire bite guard, and they have a mouthful
Oh
of
yeah.
teeth. So we never got a picture, but we brought them in, and as we're trying to decide how to take this picture and not deal with the
Oh.
he threw the line, and it was like my first trigger, and it was on tape, and I didn't get a picture, but just gives me a reason to do it again. So, I have landed tarpon and bonefish and small permit, and I mean small permit,
Yeah.
um, from a boat, a flats boat, and it is much trickier. You really have to not give an inch, and rod position is critical. So you play low to the water, you keep the fishing triangle, which is my pet peeve with people. 90-degree angle from the fish to the tip of the rod, right in there. That's my 90-degree angle. And you fish along a plane that's about 45 to 65 degrees off the surface of the water. So always playing to the side.
Hmm.
As that fish runs, you go lower. so you're going to take it down real low off the surface of the water. And you've got to get into the backbone of the rod. I mean, at that point, it doesn't matter about the flex. You are into the handle of the rod, and you're spreading the load. Even distribution is critical, and you have microseconds to get into that power position and then stay there. And, I tell people, forget the fish. You worry about that 90-degree angle, that fishing triangle. If you stay in the triangle, you will keep steady pressure on the fish and he can't go anywhere. The minute you start to compromise that 90-degree angle and your rod tip starts to move towards the fish, you get into a precarious situation. On a boat, it's worse because you don't have really anywhere to move. When you're waiting,
you take a step or two.
You can catch up while you bring the rod back to regain that position. So, I sometimes run up and down the length of what the 18-foot flats back and forth, and it's pretty much get out of the way. I'm on deck. I have a fish. That takes precedent over anything else. Just clear the path for me, And I have actually, not that I ever encourage anyone to ever do it, but I have jumped off of the boat into the water to stay connected to a fish.
That's awesome.
So,
that's great. That's great. Let's talk about that triangle scenario. Really dive into that. Let's start with a very, very basic beginning position, and then how you're manipulating your rod or body, etc., to cushion the fight and steer your fish.
So this was something that it was kind of interesting because I kept being asked, how are you landing these bonefish? It's impossible. They run, they take you into their backing. There's no way that you can land it without a reel. And I didn't have an explanation. People would ask and I would be like, I don't know, it just works. And it was working repeatedly. It wasn't just a stroke of luck.
Right.
So I started looking at video clips, frame by frame by frame, and trying to figure out what was happening, because I could remember the fight in my mind, but I had this now vantage point of watching the video while I was reliving it and watching what the rod was doing and what my body was doing. And I had an epiphany. I was like, oh my God, it's triangles. It's all about triangles. And I realized that every time I was in control and things were good, I was in about a 90-degree triangle, meaning there's 3 points in a triangle, right? There's me, there's the fish, and there's the tip of the rod. And when you draw a line between those 3 points, you get a triangle. Well, when the angle between the fish and my rod tip was about 90 degrees, life was good. The minute that I went below about 65 degrees and that angle started to collapse, things went south very, very quickly. And so I started to think about on a rod and reel, was it the same? And it was, to my astonishment. So when you're on a rod and reel and you hook into a fish, say, whatever, a trout, rainbow trout, or a bonefish, you hook in and you're up here and life is good. The minute that fish runs, you tend to drop your rod. Okay, so when you're up here, you're at about 90 degrees and you're on your rod and reel and you're playing the fish. When that fish gets crazy and starts to take off and run, not only does he take line, but you also lower your rod tip in response to that, to let that line come off your reel and that fish run. When the fish gets tired, right, and pauses or hesitates, that's your cue to start reeling in. And you reel that line in, and as you reel that line in, you start bringing your rod tip back up and you reestablish that 90 degrees. You do that over and over again until the fish is in, right? Dropping the rod, bringing it back up, closing the angle, reestablishing it. When you land the fish, you know, a lot of times when the fish is up closed, we see, you know, in fly fish magazines, these pictures of anglers like leaning way back, right? They're like, oh, they're doing back bends while they're bringing the fish in close because they're trying to keep that angle open, right? And that distance while the fish is coming in closer. Same thing on a Tenkara rod. When you stay in that 90 degrees, you are in control. The minute that you let that fish run, there's no line to take on a Tenkara rod. So what happens is that fish actually pulls your rod out in front. If you let the fish run, you know, full on, right, your rod would just straighten and you'd be holding it out in front of you, right?
Complete tension on the straight line.
Straight line for your arm, the rod, the line, the fish, and everything would pop off and the fish would be gone, right? So you never let your rod go past about 65 degrees. And what that entails is working from the side, because if you play that 90 degrees up top, you put all the pressure on the top section of your rod. And that's where people break their tips on their Tenkara rod, right? Because they're playing up high. And from this angle, even though you have 90 degrees, you're not engaging the entire rod. So you're putting all that pressure on the top. When you lay the rod over to the side, two things are accomplished. One, you've got that 90-degree angle. And two, you're able to spread the load along the length of the rod easier and stay out of that tip section and instead get into the backbone of the rod a little bit more. The other thing is it becomes all in your field of view. I can see my rod and my curve, and I can see the fish. Everything is out in front of me, or, you know, in my typical field of vision, rather than up here. The more pressure I put on the fish, the more pressure I put on the tip. I can't see my rod unless I look behind me, and I'm probably going to break it. The other thing to keep in mind is when you play up high, right, you're playing on the tip section. Well, that top section is the softest, bounciest part of your rod. So if you're lucky enough to not break the tip, you're probably going to break the tippet because you've got uneven tension, right? And you're going to bounce and pop that tippet, or the fish is going to throw the hook because of the uneven tension. So by laying the rod over to the side, you're keeping steady pressure on the fish, on the line, on your tippet, and you're engaging your entire rod.
You're taking the fish out of a position of power too.
Absolutely.
You're turning their head. So
exactly. So, you know, I say controlled choices. It's like if you're a parent and you have a toddler, you don't ask a 4-year-old, what do you want to eat? You say, do you want carrots or do you want an apple? You know, do you want carrots or broccoli? You know, controlled choices. The same thing with the fish. It's like, we can move, but you're not going to run. I'll let you go to the left. I'll let you go to the right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of in salt water, or even in fresh water, a lot of times a guide will, when you're on a big fish, a guide will say, point the rod opposite the fish, point the rod opposite the fish. They never explain why. And I actually think a lot of guides don't really understand the physics of why they do that. They just know it works. Instinctually, it works. But when you're applying pressure opposite the fish, if my rod is over here, the fish should be going that way. The minute that fish turns and starts to head towards my rod tip, I need to flip my rod to the other side. Every time I do that, I reestablish my 90-degree triangle. And that is what keeps pressure on the fish and controls the head, as you said. Control the head, control the rest of the body.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great tip. How do people get a hold of you, Karin? What's the best way to do that?
Through our website at zentenkara.com. There's contact us is always a great way. And I do answer 99% of those personally myself. They can also email me directly at Karin, Karin. So I'm Karin with an I at zenflyfishinggear.com.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And you also, I know, travel quite a bit to local shows, etc. So, if you guys see Karin, stop by the booth, say hello, whatnot, give it a feel. There's usually casting decks, etc. Give it a try. So, Karin, it was great having you on the show. Obviously, a diehard in your space and know your stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing all your photos across social media. I always enjoy, especially the saltwater. For me, it's just incredible to see that. And it was great having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, hey, that's it for this week, guys. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening.